Sheriff Daniels snatched the smallest child, a girl no older than 4, straight out of Eleanor Brooks's arms. Just like that. No warning, no hesitation. The little girl screamed. Eleanor lunged forward. 2 deputies grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her back into the mud so hard she fell to her knees. "Property of the county now," Daniels said, not even looking at her. He handed the child off to a man in a clean suit like she was a parcel of dry goods. Eleanor's other 6 children pressed against her back, shaking. The crowd watched. Some looked away. Most didn't. If that had been your child, your family, what would you have done? Well, if this kind of story moves you, hit subscribe right now and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. Because I promise you, what happens next will change how you see strength forever. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it hits your heart, leave a like. Every single one tells me to keep going. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning of October 3rd, 1878, started the same way every hard morning in Caldwell Creek started, with cold air, mud, and the particular silence of people who had already decided not to get involved. Eleanor Brooks had been awake since before the sun came up. Not because she wanted to be. She'd barely slept in 3 weeks. Not since the county notice arrived tacked to her front door like an insult. A folded piece of paper with official ink that told her she owed $412 in debts she had never once agreed to, debts traced back to her late husband, Harold, who had been dead for 11 months and therefore could not explain himself. She had read that notice at least 30 times. The numbers never changed. $412. In 1878, a working man in Colorado might earn $40 in a good month. Eleanor was not a working man. She was a widow with 7 children, a farmhouse that leaked in the rain, 2 aging mules, and a reputation in town that had never been particularly kind. She was a large woman. That was the word people used when they were being polite. When they weren't being polite, and in Caldwell Creek, that was most of the time, they used other words, words she had heard so many times they had settled into her skin like old splinters, mostly forgotten until something pressed on them wrong. She had her husband's coat draped over her shoulders that morning. It was too small across the back and smelled like sawdust and pipe tobacco, which was exactly why she wore it. Harold had not been a perfect man. He'd been stubborn and secretive and sometimes so far away in his own head that she could be standing right next to him and feel completely alone. But he had loved her. She was sure of that. She held on to that certainty the way you hold on to a fence post in a hard wind, not because it's comfortable, but because it's what's keeping you from going over. She had spent the previous night going through every drawer, every coat pocket, every tin she'd hidden money in over the years. She found $11.30, a broken pocket watch, and a letter Harold had never mailed to his brother in Missouri. She didn't read the letter. She put it in her apron pocket and kept searching. $11.30 against $412. She knew what was coming. She had known for days. But knowing a thing and surviving it are 2 very different experiences, and Eleanor Brooks had not yet figured out how to do the second one. She dressed the children before dawn, all 7 of them. She washed their faces with water that was barely above freezing, combed their hair, made sure their clothes were as clean as she could get them. She didn't tell them why. The older ones, Thomas, who was 14, and Ruth, who was 12. They understood without being told. They moved through the morning quietly, helping the younger ones with their buttons and their boots, the way children do when they've already absorbed too much adult pain and don't know what else to do with it. The youngest, Clara, kept asking where they were going. "Into town," Eleanor told her. "Why?" "Because we have to." Clara accepted this the way 4-year-olds sometimes do, not satisfied exactly, but willing to be distracted by the biscuit Eleanor pressed into her hand. She was good that way, Clara, easy to comfort, quick to smile. Eleanor had spent the last 3 weeks memorizing that smile, the way you memorize something you're afraid you're about to lose. The walk into Caldwell Creek was 2 miles on a dirt road that the October mud had turned into something closer to a bog. Eleanor carried Clara on her hip and held the hands of the 2 next youngest with her other arm, which was not physically possible without an uncomfortable amount of leaning and shifting, but she managed it anyway. Thomas walked beside her without being asked, carrying the family's one decent lantern, even though it was daylight, because he didn't know what else to offer her, and he needed to offer something. They arrived at the town square just after 8 in the morning. The square was already full. Eleanor had not expected that. She had somehow, foolishly, she realized now, imagined this would be a quiet thing, a transaction. A few officials, some paperwork, and then whatever awful thing came next. She had not imagined an audience. But Caldwell Creek turned out for things like this. It turned out the way small towns always turn out for other people's disasters. Not out of cruelty, exactly, though cruelty was certainly present, but out of that particular human combination of boredom and relief. Relief that it was someone else's disaster and not their own. Relief made people loud and mean in ways they might not have been otherwise. She heard the comments before she had even reached the edge of the crowd. That's her? Lord, she's big enough to be her own barn. 7 children and she can't pay her debts. What did she expect? Surprised Harold Brooks didn't run off. I would have. Eleanor kept walking. She had long ago learned that stopping to respond to comments like these only prolonged the experience. You kept your eyes forward, you kept moving, you held on to whatever was in your hands, and you kept moving. Sheriff Harlan Daniels was standing on the raised boardwalk in front of the county office. He was a lean man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed mustache and the careful posture of someone who had spent a long time practicing the appearance of authority. He had papers in one hand and his other thumb hooked in his belt, and when he saw Eleanor coming through the crowd, he didn't look uncomfortable. That was the thing Eleanor noticed. He didn't look uncomfortable at all. Standing beside him was a man she recognized and had hoped never to see again in a context like this. Cyrus Holt, banker, owner of the Caldwell Creek Savings and Trust, a man who had soft hands and hard eyes, and who dressed every single day as though he were on his way to a dinner party that nobody else had been invited to. He was watching Eleanor approach with an expression she could only describe as satisfied, and that satisfaction, so naked, so unguarded, turned her stomach in a way that pure fear alone had not managed to. She had met Holt twice before. Once when Harold had gone to discuss a loan she hadn't known about until later. Once when Holt had come to the farm himself, uninvited, walking the property boundaries with a man she didn't recognize, pointing at things and making notes. Harold had told her not to worry about it. She had worried about it. Standing there in the mud, looking up at Cyrus Holt's satisfied face, Eleanor understood. Not with her mind yet, but with something older and deeper than her mind. That she was not here because of bad luck or bad timing. She was here because someone had put her here. She didn't have words for it yet. She didn't have proof. She had nothing but that cold understanding moving through her chest like creek water in November. Mrs. Brooks. Daniels didn't raise his voice. The crowd quieted on its own. You received notice of the outstanding debts against the Brooks estate, in the amount of $412. Have you come to satisfy that debt? I've come to discuss it, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. There are errors in that accounting, debts my husband never mentioned, loans I have no record of. The records are at the county office, Daniels said, and they've been reviewed. The debt is valid. I'd like to review them myself. That time has passed, Mrs. Brooks. It hasn't passed because I'm standing here right now asking. The period for contest was 30 days from the notice. Daniels was not unkind. That almost made it worse. He had the tone of a man explaining something to someone he considered not quite up to understanding it. That period expired 4 days ago. Eleanor's mouth opened, closed. She had not known about the 30-day period. The notice itself had not mentioned a 30-day period. She turned to look at Holt and found him still watching her with that same expression, and she understood that the 30-day period had also been intentional. The paperwork had been designed so that a woman without a lawyer, without money for a lawyer, would miss it. Under the terms of the debt agreement, Daniels continued, pulling out the top document and holding it up, more for the crowd than for her. In the event of non-payment, the county is authorized to collect assets of equivalent value from the estate. My farm, Eleanor said. Your farm, yes. Your livestock. And he paused, and in that pause, Eleanor felt something shift in her, something that had been afraid turn into something much more dangerous. In cases where assets are insufficient, which is the case here, the court has authorized the temporary indenture of minor dependents until the debt is satisfied through their labor. The square went quiet in a different way than before. Even people who had come to watch were not entirely comfortable with this part. You could see it move through them, a slight shifting, a few people looking down, but not enough discomfort to make any of them step forward. Never quite enough for that. Eleanor looked at her children. Thomas had gone completely still, his face the face of a boy trying to become stone so that he wouldn't have to feel anything. Ruth had her arm around 8-year-old James. The little ones didn't understand yet, not fully, but they could read their mother's body, the way all children can, and what they read made Clara press her face against Eleanor's neck and tighten her fists in the fabric of Harold's old coat. "You are not taking my children," Eleanor said. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised. "Mrs. Brooks, you are not taking my children." Louder this time, not screaming, just absolutely certain. "I don't care what your paperwork says. I don't care what period has passed. You are not taking my children." Daniels looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded to the deputies. 2 men stepped forward, and Harlan Daniels himself walked directly to Eleanor, reached out, and lifted Clara from her arms. Clara didn't understand what was happening for 1 full second. Then she understood, and she screamed, a sound Eleanor had never heard from her before, a sound so raw and terrified that it cut through every other noise in the square and left nothing behind it. Eleanor lunged. Both deputies caught her at the same moment, one on each arm, and when she pushed back against them with everything she had, and Eleanor Brooks had more physical strength than most men in that square would have wanted to admit, they shoved her forward into the mud. Hard. She went down on both knees, Harold's coat falling open, Clara's scream still cutting through the air. "Let her go!" Thomas was moving forward, 14 years old, barely shaving, moving straight toward the deputies with his jaw set and his fists clenched, and Eleanor saw with absolute clarity what was about to happen. Her son was about to do something that would get him hurt, or worse, and she could not get up fast enough to stop it. "Thomas!" Her voice cracked for the first time. "Thomas, stop!" He stopped, but only because of her, not because he'd lost his nerve. The boy had nerve to spare, which was both one of the things she loved most about him and one of the things that currently terrified her. She got to her feet herself. Nobody helped her up. She stood there in the mud with her knees aching and Clara's scream fading into hiccuping sobs from somewhere behind Daniels, and she looked out at that crowd, all those watching faces, all that carefully maintained distance, and she thought, not one of you is going to help me. Not one single person in this square is going to step forward. She had known that. She had always known that, really. But knowing it and feeling it are different things, and what she felt in that moment was a loneliness so complete it almost had a physical shape, a wall of it between her and every other human being present. The bidding started almost immediately. Daniels consulted his papers. He had a list. The children had been assigned out to farms and households that needed labor. Households that had apparently already arranged this, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how long this had been in the planning. James went first, 8 years old. A farmer 2 counties over was willing to take him in exchange for debt reduction. Daniels read the name and the amount. Eleanor stopped hearing things correctly after that. The words were reaching her, but they were coming through something thick, like she was underwater. She could see Holt on the boardwalk, still watching her. She could see her children's faces. She could see Clara being held by a county woman who kept trying to soothe her and could not because Clara didn't want soothing. Clara wanted her mother. She heard herself speaking. She thought she was arguing, presenting something, trying to make some kind of case that would make them stop. Later, she could not remember what she had said. And then the square went quiet in a way it hadn't gone quiet before. A different kind of quiet. Eleanor turned, because the crowd was turning, because something was happening at the edge of the square that was pulling every eye in that direction. A horse. A very large horse, moving through the crowd at a walk that was somehow more commanding than a gallop, because the horse wasn't hurrying and neither was the man on its back. The crowd parted, not because they wanted to, because the horse gave them no other option. The man was enormous, not in the soft way of men who ate well, in the hard way of men who had been shaped by a life that didn't care about their comfort. I was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, with a beard that had not seen a barber recently, and hands on the reins that were scarred across the knuckles, in the specific way of men who had spent years working with rope and rock and cold. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat that looked like it had survived things the wearer probably had too. Nobody in Caldwell Creek seemed to know exactly who he was, But everybody seemed to know exactly what he was. The kind of man you don't make trouble with. The kind of man who has already seen worse trouble than you're capable of making, and it shows. He stopped his horse directly in front of the boardwalk. He looked at Daniels. He looked at Holt. He looked at Clara, still crying in the county woman's arms. He looked at Eleanor, standing in the mud with her knees stained dark, and Harold's coat hanging open, and something moved through his expression that was hard to name. Not pity, exactly. Something harder than pity. Something more like recognition. He reached into the saddlebag without a word. The pouch hit the boardwalk planks with a sound that stopped everything. A heavy sound. A sound with weight to it. Gold has a sound that's different from other things, even through leather, and every person in that square heard it. Daniel stared at the pouch. Then at the man. "Sir, $412, the man said. His voice was low, not loud. He didn't need loud. "Count it." Daniels picked up the pouch. His hands were not entirely steady. The crowd had stopped breathing, or that was how it felt. But every face in that square was turned toward the boardwalk, and nobody was saying a word, and in that silence Eleanor heard Clara's hiccuping slow and stop, as even a 4-year-old understood that something had shifted. Holt stepped forward. "Now just a moment. I wasn't speaking to you." The mountain man didn't look at him. He was still looking at Daniels. "Count it." Holt's jaw tightened. He was not a man accustomed to being not spoken to. He was a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, and this was not going the way any room he'd entered had ever gone. He looked around, perhaps hoping that Daniels or someone in the crowd would back him up. Nobody did. Daniels counted. His lips moved. It took about 2 minutes, and those 2 minutes were the loudest silence Eleanor had ever experienced. When he finished, he looked up with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Relief, maybe. Discomfort. The face of a man who had agreed to do something and was now, possibly for the first time, feeling the full weight of what that something was. "It's all there," Daniel said. "Then the debt's cleared," the man said. "In full. The property, the livestock, the children. All of it stays with Mrs. Brooks." Holt's voice went sharp. "This is highly irregular. The arrangement has already been—" "The debt's cleared." The mountain man finally looked at him. Just looked at him. "Isn't it?" It was not a question. Something happened to Cyrus Holt's face in that moment. Something went out of it, that satisfied, unguarded certainty. And what replaced it was something Eleanor recognized immediately, because she'd been feeling it all morning herself. A cold, unwanted understanding that a situation you thought you controlled had just moved beyond your reach. "Yes," Holt said. The word came out tightly, like it cost him something. "The debt is cleared." The crowd exhaled. Clara was placed back in Eleanor's arms. The little girl grabbed onto her neck and held on with the complete focused strength of a child who has been frightened past the point of words, and Eleanor held her back with both arms and pressed her face into Clara's hair and breathed. Thomas was next to her. She didn't remember him crossing the square. He was just suddenly there, his hand on her arm, and then Ruth was there, and James, and all of them, all 7, pressing close, and Eleanor stood in the middle of them, like the center point they all revolved around, holding them together by sheer presence, the way she had been holding them together for 11 months. She became aware that the mountain man had not moved. She looked up at him. He was still on his horse, still watching her with that expression she hadn't been able to name. And then he said something that replaced every other sound in Caldwell Creek and hung in the cold October air like smoke. "I'll take her," he said, "and all 7 children." The square stayed silent for one long, suspended second. "As my wife." Eleanor stared at him. He was a stranger, a complete stranger on a large horse, looking down at her from a height that should have been threatening and somehow wasn't, looking at her with an expression that was, strange as this was, improbable as this was, completely serious. She looked around at the crowd, at Holt's face, which was now very carefully expressing nothing, at Daniels, who had stepped back slightly from whatever this was, at the watching faces of people who had come to see her humiliated and were now witnessing something they hadn't prepared themselves for. She looked back at her children, at Thomas, whose expression had moved from stone-faced determination into something more complicated, the face of a boy trying to figure out if this stranger was dangerous or the only thing standing between them and the alternative they'd just avoided. At Clara, who had stopped crying entirely and was now watching the man on the horse with the large, solemn eyes of a child, assessing whether something can be trusted. Eleanor had $11.30. She had a farm she'd lost once today, and couldn't be certain she wouldn't lose again. She had 7 children and a husband who was dead, and the cold, growing certainty that his death had not been what it appeared to be. She had no good options. She was clear-eyed enough to know that, but she had one option she hadn't had 5 minutes ago. And Eleanor Brooks, who had walked 2 miles through October mud carrying a 4-year-old because every other door had closed, understood better than most people the difference between a good option and the only one. "Who are you?" she asked him. "Thorne Calloway," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them blinked. "All 7, she said. That was not a question. That was a condition. All 7 stay together. I said all 7. And nobody, she said, tells me what to do with my own children." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a well-placed statement. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. Eleanor Brooks looked around one more time at Caldwell Creek, at the mud and the boardwalks, and the watching faces, and Cyrus Holt's very carefully blank expression, and she made the decision that would change every remaining year of her life. She shifted Clara to one hip. She held out her other hand to Thomas, and without another word to anyone in that square, she started walking toward Thorne Calloway's horse. The crowd watched her go and said nothing. Cyrus Holt watched her go, and behind his careful blankness, something moved that was not nothing at all. Something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, very much like a plan that had just failed, but had not yet given up. Nobody in Caldwell Creek said goodbye to them. That was the thing Eleanor kept coming back to as Thorne Calloway's wagon rolled out of the square and onto the North Road. Not one person called after her. Not one face in that crowd softened into something resembling decency. A few turned away. Most just watched, the way you watch weather move through. Interested in the spectacle, indifferent to what it cost the people caught inside it. She had lived in this territory for 9 years. She had bought flour from those people. She had sat near them in the town hall during drought meetings. She had nodded at their wives on the road. 9 years, and not one of them stepped forward this morning, and not one of them said goodbye now. Eleanor sat in the back of the wagon with Clara in her lap, and the other 6 children pressed around her, and she watched Caldwell Creek get smaller behind them, and she told herself she was not going to cry about it. She had made a decision. She was going to live inside that decision without flinching. She managed it for about 4 miles. Then Clara said, very quietly, "Mama, are we going home?" And Eleanor pressed her lips together and looked up at the sky, which was the cold gray of October in Colorado, and breathed very carefully until she trusted herself to speak. "We're going somewhere safe," she said. Clara considered this. "Is it far?" "Yes." "Will there be biscuits?" Eleanor laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it came out a little rough and strange, but it was real. "I'll make sure of it," she said. Thomas was sitting nearest to the front of the wagon, close enough that he could watch Thorne Calloway on the bench ahead without being obvious about it. Eleanor could see him doing it, that careful sideways watching that teenage boys do when they're trying to assess a man without giving away that they're assessing him. Thomas had been doing this his whole life with men his father brought around. He was good at it. He had picked up on things Eleanor herself had missed, sometimes. What Thomas thought of Thorne Calloway, he wasn't saying yet. Thorne himself said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. He drove the wagon at a steady pace and didn't offer conversation, which Eleanor found both strange and, she admitted to herself, something of a relief. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired. The kind of exhausted where making words come out correctly requires active effort, and pleasantries require more effort than she currently had. The children settled around her in stages. The little ones fell asleep against her sides. James, who was 8 and had his father's habit of picking at his thumbnail when he was nervous, picked at it until Eleanor gently covered his hand with hers. Ruth sat straight-backed and watchful, 12 years old, and already carrying the particular gravity of a girl who had been forced to understand too much too soon. It was Ruth who spoke up first, in a voice pitched low enough that Thorne might not have heard it from the bench. "Do you know him?" "No," Eleanor said. "Then why—" "Because the alternative was worse." Eleanor met her daughter's eyes. "You know that." Ruth held her gaze for a moment, checking something. Then she nodded and looked away. Ruth had always been the one who needed to see that Eleanor had thought things through. She could accept hard decisions if she trusted they were actual decisions and not just panic wearing a disguise. The road north narrowed around midday and began to climb. The trees changed character, the scrubby pines of the lower elevation giving way to older, thicker growth, the kind that blocked out the sky in patches and made the temperature drop noticeably even at noon. The wagon rocked on the rougher ground, and the younger children woke up disoriented and hungry, and Eleanor had nothing to give them. That was when Thorne stopped the wagon. He climbed down without explanation and went to a compartment built into the wagon side that Eleanor hadn't noticed. He came back with a cloth bundle that, when unwrapped, contained a round of hard cheese, a wrapped parcel of dried elk meat, and something that turned out to be a dense, dark bread that could have been used to build things with. He held it all out to Eleanor without ceremony. "Not fancy," he said. "I wasn't expecting fancy," she said. He nodded and went back to the bench. Eleanor distributed the food with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been stretching meals across 7 children for 11 months. She gave the largest portions to the 3 youngest, cut the cheese carefully, tore the bread into pieces that were manageable. Nobody complained. Her children had learned not to complain about food. It was while she was doing this that Thomas moved up to the bench and sat beside Thorne. Eleanor noticed it but didn't interfere. She watched from the corner of her eye. For a while neither of them said anything. Thomas had his arms on his knees and his eyes on the road, the same posture Thorne had, which might have been coincidence and probably wasn't. "You've been up this way before?" Thomas asked finally. "Many times," Thorne said. "You live up there?" "Yes." Thomas processed this. "Alone." A pause. "Until now." Thomas turned to look at him directly. Then, a thing most grown men in Caldwell Creek would have avoided doing without an invitation. "Why'd you do it?" "Pay our debt." "You don't know us." Thorne was quiet long enough that Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I knew your father." The wagon kept moving, the trees kept passing. Eleanor's hands went still on the bread she was holding. "Harold Brooks," Thorne said. Not a question. "I was a good man." Thomas turned back to the road. His jaw worked. He was 14 and trying very hard not to show that this had hit him somewhere undefended. "Yeah," he said, "he was." That was all either of them said for a while, and Eleanor sat in the back of the wagon with her heart doing something unsteady in her chest, and she thought, he knew Harold. He knew Harold, and he said nothing about this in town, nothing to her directly, and that was information she was going to need to think about very carefully. They reached the mountain in the late afternoon, and mountain was the only word for it. Not a gentle slope or a rolling hill, but a genuine mountain, the kind that made the sky look smaller. The road, if it could still be called that, had become a series of switchbacks cut into the rock face, and Eleanor sat very still and did not look down the left side of the wagon because the drop was considerable and the looking was not helping anything. The children were largely silent by now. Even Clara had stopped asking questions, which meant she was genuinely overwhelmed, because Clara always asked questions. When the cabin came into view, Eleanor's first thought was that cabin was not the right word for it. It was enormous. Not in a wealthy, decorative way. In a purely functional, this structure was built to survive things way. Heavy logs, fitted with a precision that suggested someone who had done this before and thought hard about every choice. A covered porch ran along the front, a separate structure behind it, probably for animals. A well. A woodpile that would have taken Eleanor 3 seasons to accumulate, stacked with the neat economy of someone who understood that surviving winter was not an accident. It sat in a natural clearing in the rock, sheltered on 3 sides by cliff face and old-growth pine, with a view to the south that in better circumstances would have been worth looking at. Thorne pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down. He turned to help Clara down first without being asked, which Clara allowed with the grave seriousness of a child determining whether something can be trusted. She looked at him from about 3 inches away, in the way very small children will examine things they're uncertain about, and then she said, "You're very big." "I know," Thorne said. "Our papa was big too." Something moved in his face. Not quite pain. Something that had learned to sit next to pain without being consumed by it. "I know that too," he said, and he set her down gently on the porch steps. Eleanor climbed down herself, declining the hand he offered, not out of hostility exactly, but because she needed to do it herself, and he seemed to understand that, because he stepped back and let her. The inside of the cabin was one large room divided by function rather than walls. A cooking area, a long table that had clearly been built in place because it could never have fit through the door, sleeping spaces along the far wall separated by hanging blankets. A fireplace big enough to stand in. The floor was packed earth covered with hides, which should have felt rough and did not, because the hides were good quality and the packing was careful. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something else Eleanor couldn't immediately identify, something animal and clean at the same time. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory. The children fanned out around her. James immediately went to the fireplace. Ruth went to the shelves along the wall, reading their contents with her eyes. The younger twins, Ben and May, who were 6, found each other's hands and stayed close. "There's room," Thorne said from the doorway. It came out slightly awkward, like he'd prepared the sentence and then lost confidence in it halfway through. "I've been adding to it, over the years, more room than I need." "I can see that," Eleanor said. She meant it as a straightforward observation, but something about his expression told her he'd taken it as reassurance, which it was also, she supposed. The sleeping arrangements took the better part of an hour to work out. Eleanor established herself and the girls on one side and the boys on the other, with the hanging blankets serving as dividers. Thorne took what appeared to be a small attached room at the back of the main space that she hadn't initially noticed, barely large enough for a cot and a trunk. He offered the main area without being asked. She noticed that too. It was after the children were settled and the fire was going and something that turned out to be a venison stew was heating over the flames. Thorne had started it without asking whether she wanted help, and she had accepted the fact of it because she was too tired to manage the politics. It was after all of that, when a kind of exhausted quiet had finally settled over the cabin and the little ones were starting to drift, that Eleanor heard it. The iron. A heavy sliding sound. Something large being moved, coming from the door. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. She crossed the room in 6 steps and reached the door and tried the handle and found it didn't move. She tried it again. It did not move. She stepped back, heart going suddenly hard in her chest, and looked at the door, really looked at it this time, and saw, running along the exterior frame, the unmistakable evidence of a heavy iron bar, slid across from the outside. He had locked them in. Eleanor's mind did several things at once. It ran through the window. The window was high and small, and she could get through it alone, but not with 7 children, not quietly, not in the dark on a mountain cliff face she didn't know. It thought about the children sleeping. It thought about Thomas, who would wake up if she called for him, who would want to do something that might make this worse. It thought about Harold, who was dead, and about Cyrus Holt's satisfied face, and about the fact that she had walked into a mountain with a stranger and let him lock the door. She stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she knocked. "Mr. Calloway?" Nothing for a moment, then footsteps outside, unhurried. "Mrs. Brooks?" "The door is locked." "Yes." She waited. He didn't elaborate. Her knuckles pressed against the wood. "I'd like an explanation." The footsteps moved, and then she heard him settle. Sitting down on the porch, she thought, from the sound of it. His voice came through this wood clearly. "Grizzly came through 3 weeks ago. Big male. He's been circling since the cold set in. He got into the lean-to last year before I had the lock fitted." Eleanor stared at the door. "I lock it every night between dark and first light," he said. "When I'm outside finishing checks, I lock it behind me. When I'm in, I bolt from inside." He paused. Didn't think to explain that before. Should have. She stood there with her hand still raised from knocking and thought about that. The matter-of-fact way he'd said it. No defensiveness. No performance of innocence. Just a plain explanation delivered through a wooden door to a woman who had every right to demand one. She thought about the lock more carefully. It was on the outside. A lock on the outside keeps things out, not in. A lock designed to imprison would be on the inside. This was a man who had thought about a grizzly bear getting in. "Why didn't you say anything before?" she asked. "Didn't want to frighten the children their first night. The alternative was frightening me." A pause. "That's fair," he said. "I'll do better." Eleanor lowered her hand. The fire was warm at her back. Through the walls she could hear May making the small sound she made when she was deeply asleep. She leaned her forehead against the door for just a moment, eyes closed. "How long before first light?" she asked. 3 hours. "Will you be out there the whole time?" "Yes." She stood up straight. "There's stew left," she said. "I'll put it aside for when you come in." A long quiet. "Thank you," he said. She went back to the fire and sat down and didn't sleep. Not really, for those 3 hours. She sat, and she listened to the mountain, and she thought about a man who paid $400 for strangers and slept outside in the October cold to make sure a bear didn't get through a door. She thought about him saying he had known Harold, and she thought about what he hadn't yet said. Morning came hard and fast on a mountain, Eleanor discovered. One moment it was dark, and the next the light was coming through every crack in the logs like it had been waiting impatiently. The children woke up disoriented and then, in the way children can, adjusted to the new reality faster than she had. Within an hour, Ben and James had found a system involving the woodpile that they were not supposed to be climbing on. Ruth had located the cooking supplies and was organizing them, because Ruth organized things the way other people breathed. Clara sat on the floor near the hearth and held a conversation with a knot in the wood that she appeared to find very interesting. Thorne came in with his arms full of split wood and stopped short at the sight of all of them awake and filling his space. And Eleanor watched something move across his face that was very quick and very honest. Something startled and overwhelmed, and underneath both of those things, something that had been waiting a long time to be surprised in a good way. He recovered quickly and set the wood down and didn't comment on it. "I need to show you the property," he said to Eleanor, "before the snow sets in hard. You need to know where everything is." "All right." The children should stay close today. Thomas, who had come in from the back near the sleeping area and caught the end of this, said, "I can take them out if I know where's safe." Thorne looked at him. "I'll show you after. Deal?" Thomas considered this like he was being offered a contract. Then he nodded. "Deal." The tour of the property took the better part of the morning and was more extensive than Eleanor had anticipated. There was a root cellar dug into the cliff face, stocked with more preserved food than she had seen in one place since the good years when Harold was alive. There were traps set at specific intervals that Thorne walked her through with exact instructions about which ones were his and which trails they were on and why. There was a secondary water source she hadn't known about, a spring that ran year-round. There was a space he called the cold room, a natural cleft in the rock face sealed with fitted logs, where he kept meat. He explained everything precisely and without condescension, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He spoke to her the way you speak to someone you expect to be capable, and Eleanor realized, walking through the property with the morning cold on her face and her boots finally dry, that she had not been spoken to that way in a very long time. Harold had, toward the end, stopped explaining things to her. She had not understood at the time that it was because he was afraid of worrying her. She understood it now, and it still stung. They were at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the south-facing view, when she said it. "You knew my husband." "Yes." "You said that to Thomas, but not to me." "I said it to Thomas because he needed to hear something solid." He looked at the view, not at her. "I should have said it to you directly. I'm still working out how to talk to people." She looked at him sideways. "How long have you been alone up here?" 7 years. 7 years. She let that sit. "What happened?" He was quiet for a long enough time that she thought he might not answer. The wind moved through the pine, and something in the distance made a sound she couldn't identify. She had grown up on flatland, and this mountain talked in sounds she didn't yet speak. "I had a family," he said finally. "Wife. A son. Fever took them in the winter of 71. I came up here after. Planned to stay through the season and kept staying." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She knew better than most that there were losses that didn't have the right shape for words. "Harold Brooks," she said after a while. "How did you know him?" "Flood," Thorne said. 73. I was working a fur run along the Arkansas when it came. I got caught on a collapsed crossing. Your husband was passing through with a trade wagon. He pulled me out before the current took me. Didn't know me from anyone, just did it." He paused. "I tried to repay him. He wouldn't take anything. Said he'd call it even if I did the same for someone else someday." Eleanor stood there in the cold mountain air with Harold's voice suddenly so clear in her head it almost hurt. His exact tone, the exact phrase, because that was exactly how Harold would have said it. She had heard him say things like that 100 times. She had always thought it was charming and slightly impractical. It turned out it was neither. It turned out it was something he actually meant, and it had traveled forward in time and landed in a town square in October and put gold on a boardwalk. Her eyes stung. She did not let them go further than that. He never told me, she said. Men like Harold don't usually tell, Thorne said. They just do. She nodded once, looking out at the view. After a while she said, he kept secrets from me. Toward the end. Thorne's expression shifted slightly. She caught it. What kind of secrets? She asked directly. He looked at her then. Fully for the first time that morning. She held his gaze and waited. I think, he said carefully, that there are things we should talk about. But I'd rather have everything in front of me when we do. There are papers, in a satchel inside. I've been waiting until you'd had a night to rest. Her chest tightened. What papers? Papers Harold sent me, about 8 weeks before he died. His voice was even. Careful. Not hiding emotion so much as managing it, which was different. He was afraid, Mrs. Brooks. I think he was afraid of what he'd found out. And I think he wanted someone he trusted to have a copy of what he knew, in case something happened to him. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The mountain moved around them. The wind picked up and then settled. Something happened to him, she said. Yes, Thorne said. I believe it did. She took a breath. The cold came into her lungs and steadied her in a way that pain can sometimes do. Tonight, she said, after the children are down, show me these papers. Tonight, he agreed. They walked back toward the cabin without speaking, and Eleanor counted her steps the way she did when she needed to keep herself from running. 38 steps. She counted 38 steps back to the porch, and by the time she reached the door, her face was completely composed. And inside the cabin, her children were making the noise that children make when they are warm and fed and beginning to relax in a new space, and she stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Thomas was showing Ben how to stack wood correctly. Ruth had found a cast iron pan and was examining it with the focused expression she used on things she intended to master. Clara had moved her conversation from the floor knot to a spot near the window where the morning light came in, and she was holding a piece of dried grass she'd found somewhere and singing to it under her breath. Thorne stepped up onto the porch beside Eleanor and stopped when he saw it. All of it. His cabin full of noise and children and life. He stood there for just a moment, and Eleanor, watching his face, saw something happen in it that she suspected very few people had ever seen. Something careful and defended give way, just briefly, to something that had been waiting behind it for a very long time. Something that looked, in the unguarded half-second before he caught it, almost exactly like relief. He cleared his throat. I'll check the south trap line, he said, and he went back down the porch steps without looking at her again. Eleanor watched him go. She didn't trust him yet. She was not a woman who trusted quickly or carelessly, and the last year had not improved those tendencies. She had questions she had not yet asked, and answers she was not prepared for, and a satchel of papers waiting in a cabin on the side of a mountain that might change everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. But she watched Thorne Calloway walk down through the clearing in his buffalo hide coat, and she thought about a man who slept on a porch in October cold, so a bear couldn't get through a door, and she thought about Harold saying, call it, even if I do the same for someone else. And she thought about 7 years alone on a mountain choosing to come down into a town square at exactly the right moment. She didn't trust him yet, but she was beginning to think, against her better judgment and most of her recent experience with humanity, that he might be worth the risk of it. She went inside to her children. The satchel was older than Eleanor had expected. It was dark leather, cracked along the spine in the way things crack when they've been carried a long time in all kinds of weather. And when Thorne set it on the table that night, it made a sound that was heavier than its size suggested. The children were down. The fire had burned to steady coals that gave off more heat than light, and the cabin was dim enough that Thorne had set a lamp on the table between them. And in that low yellow light, Eleanor could see the initials burned into the leather of the satchel. H.B. Harold Brooks. She put her hand on it before she opened it. Just for a moment, she wasn't sure why. Some instinct that once she opened it, The version of her life she had been living. The version where Harold's death was a terrible accident, and the debt was bad luck, and the auction was simply what happened to women without resources. That version would close permanently, and whatever came after would require a completely different kind of strength than the one she had been using. She opened it. Thorne sat across from her and didn't rush her. She was beginning to understand that about him. He had a capacity for stillness that most people didn't, not the stillness of someone biding their time, but the stillness of someone who had learned that some moments required waiting and had made a kind of peace with that. There were 3 documents inside: a hand-drawn map, a letter in Harold's handwriting, and a surveyor's report, official-looking, with a seal at the bottom that Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. She picked up the letter first because it was Harold's hand, and reading his handwriting was like hearing his voice, and she needed that before she needed anything else. He had written it in October of the previous year. 8 weeks, Thorne had said, before Harold died. The letter was not long. Harold had never been a man who used 20 words when 10 would do. Thorne, I'm putting this in your keeping because I don't know who else I trust with it, and I can't trust the mail not to be opened. I found something on my land. The surveyor's report is attached. I had a man come out quietly, paid him myself, kept no copies at the house. There is silver under my south field. Not traces. A vein. The kind that changes things. Holt knows. I don't know how he found out before I could file properly, but he knows. He came to see me last week with an offer to buy the land at a price that was insultingly low, and when I declined, he smiled at me in a way I did not like. I have been careful, but I am not certain I have been careful enough. If something happens to me, and I write that knowing it sounds like the talk of a frightened man, which I am, make sure Eleanor and the children are not left without recourse. The claim needs to be filed properly. I would do it myself, but I don't know who at the county office is Holt's and who isn't. I trust you to know what to do. You pulled me out of the river once. I told you we were even. We were not. Harold. Eleanor read it twice. The second time she read it the way you read something when you're trying to make it say something different. And it didn't say anything, and she set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat on the wood and breathed. He knew, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He knew he was in danger, and he didn't tell me. He was trying to protect you, Thorne said. I know that. Her voice came out harder than she intended that time. I know exactly what he was doing. That doesn't make it... She stopped, started again. I could have done something. If I had known, I could have... What? Thorne said, and it wasn't unkind, just honest. Gone to the county office? Gone to the sheriff? Holt had the sheriff eating from his hand before Harold ever found that silver. Everything Harold tried to protect you from, you'd have walked straight into. She knew he was right. She hated that he was right with a specific, miserable intensity that she recognized as grief wearing an argument's clothing. She had learned to recognize it because Harold used to do the same thing. Fight about the wrong thing because the right thing was too large to approach directly. She picked up the surveyor's report. The language was technical and dense, but the summary was not. A confirmed mineral deposit of significant extent beneath the south field of a property identified by its legal description, which Eleanor recognized as their land. The surveyor's name was at the bottom, a man named Aldous Crane, out of Denver. Is this Crane still alive? Eleanor asked. As far as I know, that's one of the things we need to establish. Thorne leaned forward, his elbows on the table. In the lamplight, the scar across his left knuckles was very visible. Here's what I understand happened. Harold found the silver. He had Crane do a quiet survey, kept the report off official record. He tried to file a mining claim in Caldwell Creek, and something went wrong. I think he was warned off, maybe threatened directly. He sent me this before he could try again, and then he died. Eleanor looked at the map. It was Harold's drawing. She recognized his hand in it, the way he always drew his sevens with a crossbar, and his compass roses slightly lopsided. The south field was marked with a hatched area that covered a substantial portion. She had walked across that field 10,000 times. She had let the children play in it. She had stood at the fence line watching Harold stare at the ground the way he sometimes did, lost in his own thinking, and she had assumed it was just Harold being Harold. The accident, she said, the one that killed him, the beam that collapsed in the barn. Yes. You think it wasn't an accident? I think a barn beam doesn't collapse by itself when a man who is healthy and careful has been maintaining it for years. Thorne's voice was even, but something underneath it was not. I think it can be made to look like one, and I think the timing is very convenient for a man who needed that land cleared of its owner before any claim could be properly filed. Eleanor sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with something you've known on some level for a long time, but haven't let yourself know consciously, because knowing it consciously required you to do something with it. She had stood at Harold's grave and believed it was an accident. She had cried for an accident. She had organized 11 months of exhausting, diminishing survival around the idea that it was an accident, that it was terrible and unfair, but ultimately no one's fault, and therefore something you absorbed and moved past. She had built her grief around an accident. It had not been an accident. It had been Cyrus Holt. The lamp between them flickered. A log shifted in the fireplace. From the sleeping area behind the hanging blankets, she could hear the sound of children breathing in sleep, which was the sound she had been falling asleep to for 14 years, the sound she associated most with the word home. She looked up at Thorne. "What do we do?" He had apparently been waiting for that question because he answered it without pause. "Three things. First, we need to reach Aldous Crane in Denver and confirm he still has his own copy of the survey. Second, we need to file the mining claim before Holt can find a way to contest the land title or muddy the ownership. Third, we need someone with legal standing and no connection to Caldwell Creek to bring this to the territorial authorities." "Can we do all of that from up here?" "Not entirely. I'll need to go to Denver." He paused. "Not immediately, and not alone." Eleanor frowned. "You need me to come." "I need Thomas to come. He's Harold's son. He has standing to file as heir. You'd need to sign documents as widow, but Thomas being present makes the claim harder to challenge." He glanced toward the sleeping area. "He's a good kid. He handles himself." "He's 14. He's also the oldest son of a murdered man, and he knows it even if no one has said it to him directly. I'd rather have him involved and informed than guessing on his own." He looked at her. "That's your call, not mine." Eleanor thought about Thomas on the wagon bench, sitting with the same posture as Thorne, asking his questions with that careful sideways watching. She thought about him moving toward the deputies in the town square with his jaw set and his fists ready. She thought about 14 years old and already carrying something that heavy. "You're right," she said. "He knows." "Then tell him what he's carrying. It's less weight when it has a name." She looked at Thorne across the table. He was watching the lamp rather than her, giving her the privacy of not being observed while she worked through it. And she thought that for a man who said he'd spent 7 years not talking to people, he was remarkably good at understanding what people needed. "When did you plan to tell me all this?" she asked. "When you came into town today. You'd had this satchel for 8 weeks. You could have come sooner." "I came as soon as I understood the full picture." His jaw tightened slightly. "I was trying to find Crane first. Confirm the survey was still intact. Make sure what I had would actually hold up before I walked into a situation I couldn't walk back out of." He paused. "I also didn't know if the auction was today until 3 days ago. When I found out, I rode." She nodded. There were things she still wanted to ask and things she wasn't ready to ask, and she was tired enough that she couldn't clearly distinguish which was which. She gathered the documents carefully and put them back in the satchel and folded the flap over. "I'll keep these," she said. He didn't argue. "There's a space beneath the second hearthstone on the left," he said. "Loose. I keep things there. It's the first place someone would search if they knew to search, but nobody knows to search. You've hidden things before. Everyone up here hides things eventually." He stood, the chair scraping back. "Get some sleep. We have time to plan. Holt doesn't know where you are yet." "Yet," she said. "Yet," he agreed, which was honest rather than reassuring, and she respected it. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. She lay in the dark of the cabin and listened to the mountain outside and went through everything Thorne had told her piece by piece, turning it over, looking for the places where it didn't hold. She was not a woman who took anyone's account of events at face value, including the accounts of people she was inclined to believe. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The places where Thorne's account might not hold were these. She couldn't verify independently that he had known Harold before last week. She couldn't verify that the satchel had been sent by Harold rather than found or acquired some other way. She couldn't verify that his arrival in Caldwell Creek at exactly the right moment was what he said it was, genuine response to learning about the auction, rather than something more calculated. She lay there and examined each of those gaps, and then she examined what she actually had. His face when Clara called him big and mentioned their papa. His voice saying Harold was a good man. The way he'd sat outside in the October cold and simply answered her questions through a door and then said he'd do better. The way he'd looked at his cabin full of children and tried to hide what that did to him. None of that was proof. Eleanor knew it wasn't proof. She had learned that people could perform things, that sincerity was something you could fake if you were good enough at it. But she had also learned, in 41 years of being a person who paid attention, that there was a difference between performance and the thing underneath performance, and that the difference showed in small things. The half second before a person controlled their face, the way they spoke when they weren't aware of being heard, what they did when they thought no one was watching. She had been watching Thorne Calloway all day. What she'd seen had not resolved her doubts entirely, but it had arranged them differently. From alarm to something more like caution, which was, for Eleanor Brooks in the current circumstances, about as far toward trust as she was capable of moving in 24 hours. She was still working through this when she heard something outside. Not the bear, not wind, something with more intention than either of those things. A sound with direction to it, coming from below the cliff, moving toward the cabin in a way that stopped and started in the pattern of something trying not to be heard. She sat up. Thomas was already awake. She could see him in the dark across the hanging blanket, sitting up in his sleeping place with the same alert stillness he'd inherited from Harold, that ability to go from fully asleep to fully awake in the space of a breath. He looked at her across the dark, and she shook her head once. Stay. And he nodded, which was the most grateful she had been for that child's ability to read her in a very long time. She moved to the door. Thorne's voice came from the other side before she reached it, low and steady. I hear it. What is it? Stay inside. She heard him move off the porch in the direction of the sound, quiet for a man his size in a way that told her he'd been moving quietly through this mountain for a long time. She stood at the door and listened and couldn't hear what was happening. It was 20 minutes before he came back. 20 minutes in which Eleanor stood at the door with her heart doing something steady and hard in her chest, and the children sleeping behind her, and Thomas watching from across the room with Harold's jaw and Harold's eyes. Thorne knocked twice. She let him in. He was carrying something, a piece of a camp lantern, smashed, with a distinctive shape she'd seen before. On supply wagons. On the kind of supply wagons that Cyrus Holt contracted to haul goods from the county seat. Someone was on the South Trail, Thorne said. He was not visibly rattled, but there was something different in his voice, tighter. Scouting. They didn't come close enough to see the cabin clearly in the dark, I think. But they were looking. Eleanor stared at the lantern piece. How would anyone know to look up here? Caldwell Creek is a small place, he said, and I'm not exactly unknown in this territory. Someone would have told Holt where Thorne Calloway lives, if he asked the right people and offered the right price. 3 days. She had been on this mountain for not even 3 days, and Holt was already sending people up the trail. The cold deliberateness of it moved through her like ice water. He's not going to stop, she said. No. Thorne set the lantern piece on the table. He's not. Thomas had come out from behind the blanket and was standing near the fireplace. He was in his socks and his sleep clothes, and he looked young in a way he didn't usually permit himself to look. But his voice when he spoke was not young at all. Tell me what's actually happening, he said. Not the short version, the real one. Eleanor looked at Thorne. Thorne looked at Thomas. Something passed between them that Eleanor recognized. The moment when a man decides to treat a boy like he's old enough to be treated like a man. Sit down, Thorne said, and he told him. He told it plainly and without softening the hard parts, and Eleanor watched her son's face as he heard it, as he heard that his father had found something valuable, that a powerful man had arranged his death to take it, that the auction had not been about debt, but about removal, about erasing every person who might have standing to contest what Holt intended to take. Thomas listened without interrupting until Thorne got to the part about the barn. Then he said very quietly, He told me that beam was fine. I asked him about it that morning. He said it was fine. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had not known that. Harold had said nothing to her about any beam. He checked it, Thomas said. I remember because I asked him if I could help, and he said he'd already checked it. That was the morning he died. His voice was doing something around the edges. Controlled, but barely. He checked it. He said it was fine. Thorne said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most honest response. Thomas sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "What do we need to do?" And the steadiness in his voice, 14 years old, sitting in a mountain cabin in his socks, hearing that his father was murdered, made Eleanor press her lips together hard. Harold would have recognized that steadiness. He'd worn the same one. "Denver," Thorne said. "Within the week if possible, before Holt finds a way to get ahead of us legally. I'll ride down tomorrow and make arrangements. You and your mother will stay here." "I want to come to Denver." "You will. Not tomorrow. When I've made sure the road is clear and we have someone to meet us there." Thorne looked at him directly. "I'm not leaving you out of this. I need you in Denver, but I need you alive to get there, and that requires not rushing." Thomas processed this. He was doing what Eleanor recognized as the thing Harold used to do, running through the logic, testing it, looking for the places where he disagreed. "All right," he said finally, "but I want to know every step as it happens, not after." "Agreed," Thorne said. "Good." Thomas stood up. He looked at Eleanor. "You should sleep, Mama." "You should sleep too," she said. "I know." He went back behind the hanging blanket, and she could hear him lie down, and she knew as well as she knew anything that he would not sleep for hours, and there was nothing she could do about that because some things you simply had to let people carry in their own way. The next morning Thorne was gone before the children were up, leaving a note in handwriting that was more careful than she'd expected. Block letters, deliberate, saying he'd be back before dark, and the south trapline was already checked and the well bucket had a crack in the left handle that needed minding. Eleanor stood in the cabin doorway with the note and read it twice. Then she went inside and fed her children and thought about what needed doing. It turned out that quite a lot needed doing. The cabin was Thorne's space organized around Thorne's habits, which were practical but singular, and 7 children required different kinds of practical than one mountain man. She spent the morning reorganizing the cooking area in ways that made sense for the scale of feeding she was about to do on a daily basis. She got Ruth to help her take inventory of the food stores in the root cellar, and they were there, in the cool dark of the cleft in the cliff face, when Ruth said something Eleanor hadn't expected. "I like it here." Eleanor looked at her. Ruth was 12 and serious and didn't say things she didn't mean. She was holding a jar of preserved beans and looking at the shelves with her inventory expression, but underneath it there was something Eleanor recognized as genuine. "It's only been 2 days," Eleanor said. "I know." Ruth set the jar back. "But it's quiet. Nobody's saying things at us." She paused. "Is that bad? To like it for that?" Eleanor looked at her daughter. This daughter who had spent the last 11 months absorbing adult worry and adult grief and the specific pain of being a girl in a town that had decided her family was a public spectacle. 12 years old and already understanding that safety could be measured by the absence of other people's opinions. "No," Eleanor said. "That's not bad." Ruth nodded and went back to counting jars, and Eleanor went back to the inventory and thought about what her daughter had just told her, and felt something complicated and protective and sad all at once. Thorne returned before dark as promised. He came in through the door, stamping mud off his boots and carrying 2 things. A bundle of papers and an expression that had resolved into something Eleanor was coming to recognize as his version of cautious optimism, which looked on him a lot like a man who had gotten what he needed but wasn't ready to say so yet. He sat down at the table and spread the papers out. "Crane is still in Denver," he said. "I reached a man who can get a message to him by end of week. He'll know the name Harold Brooks, and he'll know what we're asking about." "You know someone in Denver?" Eleanor asked. "I know people in a lot of places," he said, which was not evasive so much as simply the truth of a man who had spent years moving through a large territory. "The message is already sent. Now we wait for the reply." Eleanor sat down across from him. Behind her, James and Ben were engaged in something with a piece of rope and 2 chair legs that she had decided not to investigate too closely. Clara was asleep early, unusual for her, which meant the mountain air was doing something. Ruth was braiding May's hair with the competent efficiency of a girl who had done this 10,000 times. It looked, Eleanor thought, disturbingly like a household. "There's something else," Thorne said. She looked at him. I came back on the East Trail. It's longer, but it gives a view of the south approach. He kept his voice level. There were two men on the road below. I couldn't get close enough to be certain, but the horses had Holt's brand, the double circle. Eleanor's hands were still on the table. She kept them still deliberately. They're watching the mountain. They're watching the road. They can't get up the main trail without passing the point I can see from the north window. But they're establishing a presence. He looked at her. Holt is telling us he knows where we are. He's also telling us he can't come up and take what he wants, Eleanor said. Thorne nodded once. Not legally. Not yet. He needs the land title to be clean before he moves on the silver, and he needs us not to file before he can arrange that. He paused. The window is short, Mrs. Brooks. A few weeks at most before he finds a legal angle or stops caring about legal angles. A few weeks. Eleanor looked at her children, her loud, alive, arguing, singing, braiding, climbing children filling this mountain cabin with the evidence of their continued existence. And she thought about Cyrus Holt on a boardwalk with his satisfied face and his long-planned patience. She thought about Harold checking a beam that was fine. She thought about Thorne riding down a mountain in the dark and coming back before sunset because he said he would. She turned back to the table. Tell me everything that has to happen, she said. In order, every step. Don't skip anything because you think I won't follow it. Thorne looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the papers into a single organized stack and started talking, and Eleanor leaned forward and listened with the particular focus of a woman who had learned definitively that the difference between surviving and not surviving was almost always whether you had paid attention to the right things at the right time. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines in a sound like water, and somewhere below in the dark, two horses with a double circle brand stood on a road and waited, and the waiting was itself a kind of pressure, the weight of a man with money and patience pressing up against the side of a cliff, looking for the crack. He would find, in time, that the mountain had no intention of cracking, but time was the thing none of them could afford to waste. The reply from Denver came on the 8th day. Thorne brought it up the mountain on a Tuesday morning, riding faster than Eleanor had seen him ride yet, and she knew before he dismounted that it was either very good or very bad, because men who have spent years alone in high places don't hurry unless there's a reason for it. He came through the door and put the letter on the table without taking off his coat. She read it standing up. Aldous Crane was alive. His copy of the survey was intact, stored with a law firm in Denver under seal. Harold had apparently arranged that too, a detail he hadn't mentioned in the letter to Thorne, possibly because he was still working it out when he wrote. Crane confirmed the deposit. He confirmed Harold's name on the original commission. And at the bottom of his reply, in handwriting that pressed harder into the paper than the rest, he had written, I was approached by a man named Holt 2 weeks after the survey. Offered payment to alter my records or destroy them. I declined. I have been waiting for someone to ask about this. Eleanor set the letter down. He's been waiting, she said. 8 months, Thorne said. He knew what it meant when Harold died. He's been sitting on this, not knowing who to bring it to. He could have gone to the territorial authorities himself. A surveyor going to the authorities against a banker with county connections, no family member to make the case, no mining claim on file. Thorne shook his head. He'd have been discredited before the week was out. He needed the heir. He needed Harold's family. Eleanor thought about Aldous Crane in Denver for 8 months, carrying this knowledge, watching a corrupt man walk free. She felt a complicated solidarity with him, the specific frustration of knowing the truth and having no mechanism to make it matter. When do we go? She asked. End of the week. I want 2 more days to watch the South Road. The men with Holt's brand have been rotating. Different riders, same horses. That tells me he's using ranch hands and not professional guns, at least for now. Thorne finally took off his coat and hung it. That will change if we're on the road. We need a route they're not watching. Is there one? There's a North Pass, longer by 2 days, harder going. He looked at her steadily. It'll be cold. And I mean genuinely cold, not town cold, mountain pass cold. I grew up in Kansas, Eleanor said. I know cold. This is different. Mr. Calloway. She kept her voice even. I walked 2 miles through October mud carrying a 4-year-old with $11 in my pocket. I think I can manage cold. Something moved in his expression, that almost not a smile that she was learning to read. Fair enough, he said. The next 2 days had their own specific tension. The tension of people who know action is coming and have to wait for it, which is its own particular kind of hard. Eleanor used the time. She was not a person who could sit still when there were things to prepare, and there were things to prepare. She talked to Thomas that evening after the younger children were down. She sat across from him at the table in the same lamp-lit configuration she'd had with Thorne a week ago, and she told him everything. Not the softened version, not the version that protected him from the harder edges of it. The full account. Crane's letter. Holt's offer and refusal. The barn. All of it. Thomas listened the way he always listened to important things, absolutely still, his eyes on the middle distance, processing rather than reacting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He knew that morning, Thomas said. Papa, when he checked the beam, I think he already knew someone was watching the farm. What makes you say that? Because he hugged me before I went in for breakfast. Thomas looked at the table. He didn't usually hug me in the yard. That was more of an inside thing. He hugged me and he held on for a second and then he let go and went back to work. He paused. I thought he was just in a good mood. Eleanor's chest ached with a specific bone-deep pain. Thomas, I'm not sad about it, he said quickly, which was not entirely true and they both knew it, but she let him have it because sometimes people needed to say the thing that let them keep moving. I mean, I am, but it also means he knew I was there. He knew. He looked up at her. That matters. It does, she said. He nodded, pulled himself together in that herald way he had. I'll be ready Thursday. She put her hand over his on the table. He let her, which he didn't always. Thursday came with a sky the color of pewter and a wind that meant business. Thorne had the wagon loaded before dawn. Supplies, the satchel under Eleanor's seat, an extra rifle she hadn't known he had until he loaded it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this for days. He helped the 3 youngest children up and checked the hitching twice, and then stood at the head of the horses looking at the south trail for a long moment. North Pass, he said, more to himself than anyone. We go north. Ruth stayed behind with the 4 youngest. Eleanor had fought this decision for 2 days and ultimately lost the argument, because the practical reality was that 6 children on a mountain pass in November cold was a problem with no solution she could accept, and Thorne had already arranged for a neighbor, a trapper's wife named Vera, who lived 4 miles east, to come stay at the cabin for the duration. Vera had arrived the night before. A small, weathered woman in her 60s who looked at the 7 children, said, I've had 8 of my own, and proceeded to take over the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had never been uncertain about anything in a domestic space. Ruth had taken one look at Vera and relaxed in a way Eleanor hadn't seen her relax in months, which told Eleanor that Ruth had been carrying more weight than she'd shown, which was not a surprise and was also quietly heartbreaking. You're in charge, Eleanor told Ruth before leaving. Not of Vera, of your siblings. I know, Ruth said. If anything feels wrong, Mama. Ruth looked at her with those 12-year-old eyes that sometimes held 40 years behind them. Go, we'll be here. Eleanor hugged her and got in the wagon before she changed her mind. The North Pass was everything Thorne had warned and a few things he hadn't mentioned, probably because he didn't want to create problems in advance. The trail was steep in places that tested the horses' patience and crossed a ridgeline where the wind came from the wrong direction and got under everything you were wearing, regardless of how well you'd layered. Thomas sat on the bench beside Thorne and didn't complain, which Eleanor watched from the back of the wagon with the particular pride of a woman watching her son choose not to be a burden. They camped one night on the pass itself, in a hollow that Thorne knew and that offered wind protection and not much else. He built a fire with the speed of someone who had done it in worse conditions, and Eleanor cooked what could be cooked over a trail fire, which was not much but was hot, and that was what mattered. Clara ate her portion with the focused intensity of a very cold child and then fell asleep against Eleanor's arm before she'd finished chewing. Thorne sat across the fire from them, eating his share without ceremony, and Thomas sat beside him in the way he'd started sitting, not imitating exactly, but close, learning a posture. Eleanor watched this from across the fire and felt something she couldn't fully name. Not replacement exactly, not a simple thing at all. You do this every winter? Thomas asked. The pass? Used to do it more, Thorne said. Fur runs mostly. Less now. Why less? Thorne poked the fire. Got older. Got more selective about what was worth the cold. Thomas thought about this. What made this worth it? Thorne looked up from the fire and across at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked back at him, and the fire moved between them, and for a moment nobody said anything, and that moment had a weight to it that Eleanor filed away to think about later when she had the space to think clearly. Unfinished business, Thorne said, and looked back at the fire. Denver arrived on the second day like a city explaining itself. Noise first, then smell, then the particular overwhelming fact of other people existing in large numbers, which Eleanor had not experienced in months, and which Clara found absolutely fascinating and slightly alarming. The little girl stood in the wagon bed holding Eleanor's arm and watching the street traffic with her eyes very wide. There are so many people, she said. There are, Eleanor agreed. Do they all live here? Most of them. Clara processed this. That seems like a lot of people to be in one place. It does. Thorne navigated the streets with the careful attention of someone who knew the city but didn't love it, working toward a specific address that turned out to be a law office on a street of law offices, distinguished from its neighbors by a green door that had been repainted recently and a small brass plate that Eleanor read twice to make sure she understood what she was looking at. She was looking at the name of the law firm Harold had used to seal Crane's survey. Harold had been here. Her husband, who had never told her about the silver or the danger or the man he'd sent a satchel to, had stood at this door and made arrangements and then gone home and checked a barn beam and hugged their son in the yard, and she had been in the kitchen making breakfast and had not known any of it was happening. She stood at the green door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Thorne stood beside her and said nothing. She knocked. Aldous Crane was a small man in his late 50s with a gray beard trimmed very precisely and the careful manner of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had learned to keep it internal. He stood up when they came in and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was partly relief and partly something that resembled guilt. The guilt of a person who has held information past the point when it might have helped and knows it. Mrs. Brooks, he said, I should have found a way sooner. I want you to know I tried. I know, Eleanor said. She did not want to spend the next hour having a conversation about what he should have done differently. She wanted to spend it on what happened next. You have the survey documents. Yes. He moved to a cabinet that was locked with 2 separate locks and opened it with 2 separate keys on a ring he kept around his neck. He pulled out a file that was thick with papers, bound with ribbon that had been tied and untied and retied many times. He set it on the desk between them. Everything, original survey, field notes, soil samples documentation, my professional certification, everything required to file a territorial mining claim. Thomas leaned forward and looked at the file. He had Harold's habit of looking at documents, not reading them immediately, but assessing their physical reality first, their thickness and age and the quality of the paper. Is this enough? Thomas asked the lawyer. The lawyer, a man named Everett Parks, who had been introduced before they sat down, and who had the demeanor of someone who had seen a great many difficult situations and had developed the useful capacity not to be visibly rattled by them, spread his hands on the desk. With the survey authenticated by Mr. Crane, with the letter your father sent to Mr. Calloway, and with your standing as heir, the claim is strong. The question is speed. If we file today, Holt cannot legally contest the ownership of the land without going through territorial court, and a territorial court challenge with this documentation would take a year to resolve and would not end in his favor. Then we file today, Eleanor said. Parks looked at her. Not in the way men in Caldwell Creek had looked at her, from a distance slightly above, with the particular condescension of people who had decided in advance what she was worth. He looked at her the way Thorne looked at her, like she was the person in the room most likely to know what needed doing. The filing office closes at 4, he said. It's 1:30. Then we should stop talking and start writing. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of documents and signatures and the specific tedium of legal process, which was its own kind of endurance test, sitting across from a desk while someone read things aloud and explained them and required responses and then explained them again to make sure the responses were fully informed. Eleanor signed her name 17 times. Thomas signed his name 9 times. Each signature felt like pushing something heavy over a threshold. Crane sat in the corner and answered questions when Parks directed them at him, and otherwise kept his hands folded in his lap with the stillness of a man who had finally, after 8 months, put down something he'd been carrying in the wrong way. Thorne stood near the door the entire time, not pacing, not sitting, just standing, watching the room, watching the window. Eleanor noticed and understood. He was listening for what was happening outside, which was the habit of a man who thought in terms of threats and exits, and had not stopped thinking that way simply because they were inside a law office. At 20 minutes to 4, Park sanded the final document and looked up. "That's everything," he said. "I'll take it to the filing office myself. Given the circumstances, I'd rather you weren't seen at the territorial courthouse today." Eleanor frowned. "Why?" "Because Holt has a man who watches that office," Thorne said from the door. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without drama, as though this was simply information. "Has done for years, I'd guess. Anyone connected to this claim walking into that building today gives him advance notice." "And you know this how?" Thomas asked. "Because if I were Holt, that's what I'd do." He looked at Parks. "Can you use a back entrance?" "I can use whatever entrance I like," Parks said, slightly stiffly, in the way of a man who takes professional pride in managing his own affairs. "I've been practicing law in Denver for 22 years. I know how to file a document." Thorne raised both hands slightly, a conceding gesture. "Then we'll wait for your word." They waited in a room off the main office that had chairs and a window overlooking an alley and a pitcher of water on a side table. Clara sat in Eleanor's lap and looked at the alley with the focused attention she brought to all new environments. Thomas sat with his arms on his knees in the posture Eleanor now associated specifically with him absorbing something difficult. Thorne stood at the window. Eleanor watched him watching the window. She had a question she had been turning over for several days now. Not the right time on the mountain, not the right time on the road, and probably not ideal in a law office waiting room, but the question wasn't willing to wait much longer. "Thorne," he turned. "When Harold's letter said he trusted you, that wasn't the only reason you came to Caldwell Creek." It wasn't a question. He seemed to understand that because he didn't answer it like one. He held her gaze for a moment, measuring something. Clara was very quiet in Eleanor's lap, which meant she was listening, and Thomas had gone very still, which meant he was listening, and Thorne appeared to understand that he was speaking to all three of them. "No," he said. "Then tell me the other reason." He looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "I came down off that mountain 6 times in 7 years. For supplies, for news, once, because a man I'd traded with for years was dying and he'd asked me to be there. 6 times in 7 years. He paused. "I came down a 7th time about 2 years ago, just to walk around. Buy a meal I hadn't cooked myself. Remember what towns sounded like." He stopped. "And?" Eleanor said. "And I saw you," he said, "in the dry goods store. You were trying to get the man behind the counter to honor a price he'd quoted the week before, and he was trying to pretend he hadn't quoted it, and you were standing there with 2 of your children at your knees, and you were not raising your voice, and you were not backing down, and you were—" He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. "You were the most determined person I had seen in a very long time, and the most tired, both at the same time, in a way I recognized." Eleanor was very still. "I didn't speak to you," he said. "It wasn't my place. You were Harold's wife, and I was a stranger passing through, and there was nothing I had standing to say. But I remembered." He looked at the window again. "When I got Harold's letter and I understood what was happening to his family, I knew I was going to come. I had already decided before I understood the full picture." Thomas was looking at Thorne with an expression that was complicated and young and very honest. Eleanor looked at Thorne for a long moment. She thought about 2 years ago. She remembered that argument at the dry goods store. The man's name was Pittman, and he had tried to charge her 6 cents more than he'd quoted, and she had stood there for 10 minutes making her case with methodical patience until he gave in. And the whole time she had been desperately aware of how tired she was, and how much she needed those 6 cents, and how much she hated needing them. She had felt, standing in that store, almost entirely invisible in the way that people without money and without a husband become invisible in small towns. She had not known anyone was watching her. She had not known anyone had seen anything in that 10 minutes worth remembering for 2 years. She didn't say anything immediately. She wasn't sure there was a single right thing to say, and she was not a woman who spoke to fill silence. She held Clara a little closer and looked back at Thorne, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. Parks came back at 4:15. He came through the door with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and an expression that was professionally controlled but not quite enough, not entirely. He set the filing receipt on the table. "It's done," he said. "The mining claim is registered under the names Thomas Harold Brooks, miner, and Eleanor Margaret Brooks, widow, as co-holders of the mineral rights to the south field of the Brooks property, Caldwell Creek, Colorado Territory." He paused. "Effective as of 3:58 this afternoon." Thomas picked up the receipt. He read it twice, slowly, in the Herald way, and then he set it down. His jaw was working. He got it under control. "What does Holt do now?" Eleanor asked Parks. "He has limited options," Parks said, sitting down finally. "He can challenge the claim in territorial court, which will be expensive and slow, and which he will lose given the documentation we've provided. He can attempt to contest the land title itself, which has the same problem. Or," he paused in a way that Eleanor didn't like, "or he decides the legal route is no longer his best option. Meaning he stops caring about legal angles," Thorne said. The same words he'd used on the mountain, and the same tone. Not alarm, just the sober acknowledgement of a fact. "It's a possibility," Parks said carefully. "A man who has already—" He looked at Thomas and chose his words. "A man with Holt's history of decision-making may not accept this outcome gracefully." "He won't," Thorne said. Eleanor stood up, which brought Clara to her feet also, in that automatic way the little girl had of mirroring her mother's posture. "Then we need to get back to the mountain," Eleanor said. "We have 4 children up there." They left Denver before 5. The light was already going, the winter dark coming in fast, and Thorne pushed the horses harder on the return than he had coming in, taking the south road rather than the north pass because speed mattered more than caution now, because Holt's man at the courthouse had either seen Parks go in or hadn't, and either way the clock was running. It was on the south road between Denver and the first foothills that Thorne held up his hand and stopped the wagon. Eleanor didn't ask why. She looked where he was looking. Dust on the road ahead. Not the dust of a single rider or a wagon. The dust of several horses moving fast, coming from the direction of Caldwell Creek, and in the fading light she could make out the shape of riders, 4 or 5 of them, riding with the purposeful speed of men who had somewhere specific to be. Men on horses with somewhere specific to be, on this road, at this hour, the same day the claim was filed. Eleanor looked at Thorne. "They know," she said. "Yes," he said. Thomas was already reaching for the rifle under the bench. Thorne put his hand on the boy's arm, not stopping him, just slowing him. "Not yet," he said. "We don't know what they want." "I know what they want," Eleanor said quietly. And she did. She knew with the same cold certainty she'd felt in the town square looking at Holt's satisfied face, that this had always been where Holt was heading. When the legal route ran out, men like Holt didn't accept defeat. They simply moved the problem into a different category. They sent riders on a south road at dusk, with enough dust behind them to mean they weren't riding for pleasure. Thorne clicked to the horses and turned the wagon off the road and into the tree line, so fast that Eleanor grabbed the sideboards and Clara grabbed Eleanor and Thomas braced himself on the bench. And then they were in the trees, and the road was empty 30 yards to their left, and the sound of hooves was getting closer. "Stay quiet," Thorne said, and his voice had changed. Not scared, that specific kind of calm that isn't calm at all, but is something that has gone past calm to a place that is more useful in a crisis. Focused and cold and entirely sure of itself. The riders passed. 5 men, all armed, moving fast, moving in the direction of the mountain, in the direction of Vera and Ruth and 4 children in a cabin with an iron lock that kept bears out but had never been tested against anything worse. Eleanor looked at Thorne. He was already turning the horses. "We go up the east trail," he said. "It's faster if you know it." "Do you know it?" "I've been riding it for 7 years in the dark," he said. "Yes." He pushed the horses, and Eleanor, Claire and Thomas held the rifle, and the mountain came up to meet them out of the dark, like something that had been waiting, and for the first time in her life Eleanor Brooks looked at a mountain in the dark and was not afraid of it. She was afraid of what was on the other side of it. and that was a feeling she intended to do something about. The East Trail in full dark was not a road, it was a suggestion. Thorne drove it like a man who had memorized every stone and drop by feel rather than sight, making turns that Eleanor couldn't see coming until the horses were already in them, leaning into the wagon's motion with the ease of someone who had made peace long ago, with the idea that a trail like this either trusted you back or it didn't. Eleanor held Clara with one arm and the sideboard with the other, and did not ask him to slow down, because slowing down was not a conversation she was willing to have. Thomas had the rifle across his knees. He wasn't holding it with the nervous excitement of a boy with a gun. He was holding it the way Thorne held things, with the specific patience of someone waiting for the right moment rather than bracing for any moment. Eleanor noticed this and felt, in the middle of everything else she was feeling, a complicated kind of grief. The grief of watching your son become someone who knows how to hold a rifle in the dark on a mountain, which was both something to be proud of and something that should never have been necessary. "How far ahead of them are we?" Thomas asked. "Depends on which trail they took," Thorne said. "If they went straight up the main south trail, maybe 40 minutes. If someone told them the east trail?" He paused. "Less." "Do you think someone told them?" Thorne was quiet for 3 seconds. "Holtz had weeks to find out everything about this mountain. I have to assume he knows the trails." He looked at Thomas sidelong. "Which means we move faster." He moved faster. The cabin came into view with light in the windows, which was both a relief and not. Light meant people were awake inside, meant Vera and the children were there, meant nothing catastrophic had happened yet. But light also meant visible, meant findable in the dark by anyone who was looking. Thorne pulled the horses up short of the clearing and stopped. "Wait here," he said, and he was off the wagon before Eleanor could respond. She watched him cross the clearing in a wide arc, staying to the tree line, moving in that particular quiet she'd noticed that first night. The quiet of a man who knew how to be part of a landscape rather than separate from it. He reached the cabin, knocked twice in a pattern she recognized as the one he'd used before, and the door opened. She saw Vera's silhouette briefly, and then Thorne was inside. He was back at the wagon in 4 minutes. "They're all right," he said. "Vera heard horses on the south trail about 20 minutes ago. They didn't come up as far as the cabin. She put the children in the back room and killed the front lamp." He looked at Eleanor. "Ruth kept the young ones quiet. Vera said she didn't have to say a word to her." Eleanor closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes. They were scouting tonight. They'll know the cabin is here now. They'll come back with daylight and a purpose." He looked at the tree line to the south. "We have a few hours." She climbed down from the wagon and lifted Clara down, and the little girl was deeply, completely asleep, had somehow slept through the last 40 minutes of mountain trail in the dark. And Eleanor held her against her shoulder and looked at Thorne. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "All of it," he told her. He had spent, it became clear, a significant portion of the ride back thinking through the geometry of the problem. 5 riders. 1 cabin. 1 approach from the south that was the obvious route. 1 from the east that was harder but possible. 1 from the north that was almost impassable in November but almost was not the same as completely. The cabin's advantages were its position, sheltered on 2 sides by cliff face, and the fact that anyone coming from the south had to cross 40 yards of open ground before reaching the porch. The disadvantages were that 1 man and 1 rifle could not cover 3 possible approaches simultaneously. "I can cover the south," Thomas said. He had climbed down from the wagon and was standing with them in the dark clearing listening. "From the north window, I can see the whole approach." "You're 14, Thorne said. "You said that before," Thomas said, "and then you kept treating me like I was 40, so let's just agree that the number doesn't mean much right now." Thorne looked at him for a moment, then he looked at Eleanor. She looked back and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. Thomas was right, and they were all aware he was right, and the fact that it was wrong that he was in this position did not change the position. "South window," Thorne said. "Not the north. Better angle on the approach, less exposure. You don't fire first. You wait for my signal, or you wait until you have no choice. You understand the difference?" "Yes." "Tell me the difference." "Your signal means you've made a decision. No choice means someone is coming through the door." Thomas held Thorne's gaze. "I know the difference." All right, Thorne said. And then he did something that Eleanor didn't expect. He put his hand briefly on the back of Thomas's neck, the way a man does with someone he trusts, and Thomas stood a little straighter under it, and Thorne moved on to the next problem without making a moment of it. Inside the cabin, Ruth was awake and composed at the table. She looked at her mother when Eleanor came through the door, and the look said, I held things together, and you should know it, and I'm also very glad you're back. And Eleanor crossed the room and hugged her, and Ruth allowed it for exactly 3 seconds before pulling back to practical. May cried, but she stopped, Ruth said. Ben fell asleep. The little ones were fine. Vera told them it was practice for a game, and they believed her. Vera is remarkable, Eleanor said. She's been through worse than this, Ruth said, which was probably true, and also told Eleanor something about what Vera had shared with the 12-year-old in the hours they'd been alone on a mountain, which was a conversation she'd have with Vera later. Vera herself came out of the back room and looked at the assembled group with the calm of someone who had been through enough that a night like this had become merely an entry in a long ledger rather than an exceptional event. Tell me what you need, she said to Thorne. Can you keep the young ones in the back room and keep them there regardless of what they hear? I can, she said. Not quietly necessarily, but in the room. Quietly or not is fine. In the room is what matters. Vera nodded once and went back to the children. Eleanor heard her voice through the partition, low and steady, the voice of a woman who had used it to calm frightened children before, and knew exactly what pitch that required. They spent the next 2 hours preparing in the specific way that preparation works when you don't know exactly what's coming, but know something is. Thorne moved through the cabin, checking angles and positions with the focused economy of someone running calculations in his head. Eleanor did not ask him to explain everything he was doing because some of it she could see plainly and some of it she was simply going to have to trust, and she had arrived, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, at the position of trusting Thorne Calloway. Not blindly, with full awareness of what she knew and didn't know, but trust nonetheless. She found this remarkable and did not have time to examine it properly. She put Clara down in the back with the others. She came back to the main room and she stood in the center of it. This cabin that was not hers, and had somehow become hers, this space that smelled like wood smoke and pine, and the particular combination of 7 children's existence. And she thought about Harold, who had stood in a different space and made different preparations, and had been alone in doing it. She was not alone in doing it. She picked up the iron poker from beside the fireplace. It was heavier than it looked, which she had noticed the first morning and had thought nothing of at the time. Now she thought something of it. She found the balance point and held it at her side. Thomas, positioned at the south window, looked back at her over his shoulder. "Mama," he said. "Focus on your window," she said. He focused on his window. Dawn was still an hour away when the first sound came from the south trail. Not horses this time. Men on foot, which was worse in one way and better in another. Worse because it meant they'd thought about this, had come deliberately and quietly, rather than riding in loud with false confidence. Better because men on foot on a mountain trail in the dark were slow. Thorne was at the north window. He held up 3 fingers without turning around. 3 men approaching from the south. She didn't know where the other 2 were, and that was the problem with all of it. The thing you couldn't see was always the thing that mattered most. The first shot didn't come from the south. It came from the east, above the cabin, and it hit the log wall 6 inches from the east window with a sound like a hammer strike, and then everything happened at the same time. Thomas fired through the south window at something Eleanor couldn't see. Thorne was already moving, crossing the cabin to the east wall, putting himself between the window and the back room where the children were. Eleanor heard Vera's voice go sharp and firm in the back room, not scared, commanding, and heard the children's sounds change from sleep-waking confusion to obedience, heard them settle. Another shot from outside, this one lower, and then a sound on the porch, boots on boards. And Eleanor moved without deciding to. She was simply moving, across the cabin toward the front door, because something was on the porch, and there were children 12 feet behind her, and she was not going to stand in the center of the room and wait for the door to open. The door opened before she reached it. The man who came through it was large. Not Thorne large, but large enough. And he had a gun in his hand, and his eyes went immediately to where the threat should have been, which was the middle of the room, which is where Eleanor was not. She was to the left of the door, which meant she was beside him rather than in front of him when he came in, and she hit him with the poker before he had fully adjusted to the dark and the wrongness of her position. She hit him across the forearm, not the head, because she was not trying to kill him, and also because the arm was closer, and the arm held the gun, and the gun was the problem. He made a sound, and the gun went somewhere on the floor, and he turned toward her, and she hit him again, this time with more of her weight behind it, with the specific force of a woman who had spent years lifting and hauling and carrying, and who had more in her arms and shoulders than most people had assumed. He went into the wall and stayed there for a moment, trying to remember how to stand. Thomas was shouting something from the south window, not panicked, reporting, and she heard Thorne return fire through the east wall through a gap she hadn't noticed him prepare, and the sound of the shot outside changed quality, moved away, recalculated. The man in the doorway was trying to recover. Eleanor put herself between him and the back room and held the poker and looked at him directly. He was maybe 30 years old. Not a professional killer. She could see that now. He was a ranch hand doing something he'd been paid to do and had not fully thought through the receiving end of. He was looking at her with an expression that had started as surprise and was moving through pain towards something that she recognized, after a moment, as recalculation. "The mining claim is filed," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She was breathing hard, but her voice was steady. "It was filed yesterday afternoon in Denver. It is on the territorial record as of 3:58 yesterday. Whatever Holt told you you were coming up here to stop, it's already done. There is nothing up here worth a criminal charge." The man stared at her. "Whatever he's paying you," she said, "it's not enough for what happens to men who assault a woman and children in a registered homestead. That is federal territory law. You know what that means." He knew. She could see that he knew. "Get out," she said, "and take whoever's with you." He was gone in 30 seconds. She heard him on the porch, heard him call out to someone, urgent, low, the voice of a man communicating a change of plan. And then the sounds on the mountain moved away, downward, retreating with the specific rhythm of people who had decided the calculation had shifted. She stood in the doorway and breathed. Thorne appeared from the east side of the cabin, coming around the porch corner, rifle in hand. He looked at her standing in the doorway with the iron poker and the man's revolver on the floor behind her, and his expression did something she didn't have a name for. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." "The man who came through the door?" "Gone." She stepped back from the doorway to let him past. I explained the situation to him. Thorne looked at the revolver on the floor. He looked at the indentation in the wall where the man had hit it. He looked at Eleanor. "You explained the situation." "Clearly enough." Thomas came from the south window. His face was pale under the bravado, but the bravado was holding. "I hit the ground in front of the south approach," he said. "Didn't aim at anyone, just changed their interest." "Good call," Thorne said. "Did I do it right?" "You did it right." Thomas let out a breath that he'd been holding for a while. He set the rifle down on the table and sat next to it, suddenly very much 14 years old again, and Eleanor went to him and put her hand on his shoulder and felt him lean into it just slightly, just enough. The children came out of the back room in stages. Vera first, reading the room with her experienced eyes, then Ruth with May and Ben. Clara came last, holding Vera's hand and looking around the cabin with the assessing seriousness of a 4-year-old determining the status of her environment. "Is the game over?" Clara asked. "The game is over," Eleanor said. Clara nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to find her piece of dried grass. The aftermath of a thing like that has its own shape. Nobody sleeps again immediately. Nobody quite knows what to do with their hands. Eleanor made coffee because it was something to do, and because the fire needed stoking anyway, and because the physical motions of making something useful helped her put herself back together in the right order. Thorne sat at the table and said nothing, and she was grateful for that, for his ability to understand that silence after something hard was not emptiness, but substance. Thomas fell asleep at the table around 4 in the morning, just tipped sideways and went, which was the most honest thing Eleanor had seen in a long time. She put Harold's coat over him and didn't wake him. Thorne watched her do it. "He's going to be something," he said quietly. "He already is," she said. She sat down across from him. The coffee was hot and she wrapped both hands around the cup. "What happens now to Holt?" "Parks will file the criminal complaint with the territorial authorities today. He was already prepared to do it. We talked before we left Denver. The chain of evidence runs from the forged debt paperwork through the timing of Harold's death, through Crane's testimony about being approached to alter the survey. He was quiet for a moment. It won't be fast. It'll be ugly. He'll fight it. But he'll lose. He'll lose, Thorne said. Men like Holt can win against people with nothing. They can't win against documented evidence in a territorial court with a law firm behind it. He built his whole plan around the assumption that you had no resources and no one in your corner. The moment that changed, his plan was finished. Eleanor looked at her coffee. Harold tried to protect me from all of it, she said, and in doing that he left me unprepared for it. Yes. She appreciated that he didn't try to reframe it. I'm not angry at him, she said. I was, for a while, on the mountain, those first nights. I was furious at him for not telling me, for keeping it from me, like I was something fragile that needed managing. She looked up. But I understand it now. He was afraid of two things at the same time. Afraid of what Holt would do, and afraid of what I would do if I knew. He was afraid I would go straight at it. You would have, Thorne said. I know, she said. And I also know that going straight at it with no documentation and no legal standing and a corrupt sheriff in the county would have gotten me and my children exactly nowhere. She paused. He wasn't wrong to be afraid of that. He was wrong not to trust me enough to figure it out together. Thorne said nothing for a moment. That's a hard thing to carry, he said finally. It's a harder thing to put down, she said, but I'm working on it. The winter light came up gray and slow over the mountain, the way it did up here, without ceremony. Eleanor watched it come through the east window and thought about what Thorne had said in the law office waiting room, about coming down from the mountain 2 years ago and seeing a woman at a dry goods counter who was tired and determined at the same time, and remembering that. She had been invisible in that moment, or had felt invisible, which was almost the same thing. She had not been invisible. It was a small thing to realize, maybe. But she had built so much of her interior life around the assumption that she was not worth looking at. Too large, too worn, too burdened, too plainly failing at the things the world seemed to think she should have managed better. She had absorbed those assessments so thoroughly that she'd stopped questioning whether they were true. She was questioning them now. Cyrus Holt's trial began in the territorial court 4 months later, in February of 1879, and it lasted 11 days. Eleanor was present for all of them. She sat in the gallery with Thomas on one side and Everett Parks on the other, and watched Aldous Crane testify in the careful, precise way of a man who has been waiting 8 months to say something true out loud. She watched 3 of Holt's own ranch hands testify against him, because when the alternative was perjury in a federal proceeding, loyalty to an employer had a natural ceiling. She watched Holt's attorney make arguments that grew progressively less confident as the documentation accumulated on the wrong side of the table. She watched Holt himself, who sat throughout the proceedings in the same expensive suit and the same careful posture, and who never once looked at Eleanor directly. She looked at him. She made a point of it. Not with hatred exactly, though there was some of that. More with the desire to see clearly. She wanted to look at him and see what he actually was, stripped of the satisfaction and the certainty. And what she saw was a man who had made a series of choices that had seemed rational at each step and had accumulated into something monstrous, and who was now sitting inside the consequences of those choices with the tight-jawed expression of someone who still hadn't fully accepted that the world was not going to arrange itself around his convenience. He was convicted on 4 counts: fraud, conspiracy to defraud, criminal interference with a mining claim, and, after 3 days of particular deliberation by the jury, criminal negligence in the death of Harold Brooks, which was not the murder charge Eleanor had wanted and was not nothing. The judge sentenced him to 12 years. 12 years was not enough. Eleanor knew that. She also knew that the world rarely gave you enough, and that insufficiency was not the same as nothing, and that she had learned to distinguish between the two. She stood on the courthouse steps in Denver on the day the verdict came in with Thomas and the cold February air and the sound of the city around her, and she thought about Harold. She thought about him checking a beam that he already knew might be wrong, and hugging their son in the yard, and writing a letter in October to a man he'd pulled out of a river 6 years earlier because he didn't know who else to trust. She thought about the fact that she was standing on these courthouse steps because of a debt Harold had called even. Nothing is ever really even. That was the thing about Harold's accounting. his fundamental stubborn belief that debts could be settled, that good acts balanced bad ones, that a life lived with integrity eventually resolved correctly. He had believed this and lived by it, and it had not saved him, and yet here she stood, on the other side of an 11-day trial, with her son beside her and a filed mining claim in the territorial record, and a mountain cabin that had become, in the space of 4 months, something she would not have predicted and could not now imagine being without. Maybe Harold's accounting wasn't wrong. Maybe it was just slow. The silver operation began in the spring. Eleanor hired 2 men from Caldwell Creek to work the initial extraction. Not men who had watched from the crowd in the town square. She was specific about that. And the early returns confirmed what Aldous Crane's survey had described. The vein was substantial. It was the kind of substantial that changed the trajectory of a family for generations if managed carefully, and Eleanor managed it carefully, the way she managed everything, with the same methodical patience she had used at a dry goods counter 6 years before. She did not move back to Caldwell Creek. This decision surprised some people and did not surprise Eleanor at all. The farmland was now valuable rather than burdensome, and she leased it properly through Everett Parks, and the income from the lease combined with the initial silver returns meant that by the first summer after the trial, she had resources she had not had in years. But resources were not the point. Home was the point, and home had relocated itself without asking her permission, which was the kind of thing that life did sometimes. Put you somewhere you hadn't chosen, and then slowly, quietly, convinced you that you'd chosen it after all. Thorne expanded the cabin that summer. He did it the way he did most things, without announcing it in advance, just started one morning and kept going. He added 2 rooms off the east side, proper rooms with fitted log walls and windows. He'd hauled up the mountain in pieces and assembled with a patience Eleanor found characteristic. He asked for her opinion on the windows. She gave it. He implemented it without argument. Thomas helped him with the construction and learned things about fitting logs and reading wood grain that he would use for the rest of his life. He also, Eleanor noticed, started finishing Thorne's sentences sometimes, in the easy, thoughtless way you do with people you've stopped thinking of as separate from your daily furniture of the world. She noticed this on a morning in July when Thorne was explaining to Thomas why a particular joint needed bracing from a specific angle, and Thomas said, "Because the grain runs the wrong way to take lateral stress here." And Thorne said, "Right." And neither of them paused, and Eleanor, watching from the porch with her morning coffee, felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not fixed. She wasn't going to pretend it was fixed. She still thought about Harold at unexpected moments. The smell of pipe tobacco, the sound of a particular kind of laugh, the way Thomas squared his jaw and made her ache with recognition. She still had mornings where the grief was fresh in the way that grief sometimes refuses to age, where she'd wake up and for 1/2 second forget, and then remember. And it was still a blow after all this time. She wasn't going to pretend that Thorne replaced anything. You couldn't replace a person. What you could do, what life made available to you, if you were willing to accept it, was add. Layer new things over and alongside the old ones until the weight of the new was enough to carry you forward without requiring you to leave the old behind. That was the thing Eleanor had figured out in a mountain cabin over the course of one very long winter. You didn't have to choose. You could carry Harold and still reach for something new. You could be a widow and still be a woman. You could be a mother of 7 and still be the person standing in a doorway with an iron poker deciding that enough was enough. The wedding was in September, small. Vera came, and Everett Parks came up from Denver, and Aldous Crane sent a letter because he couldn't make the journey but wanted it noted that he was glad for the outcome. The children were all present, obviously, including Clara, who wore a blue ribbon in her hair, and informed everyone who would listen that she had always known this was going to happen, which was not true and was very characteristic of Clara. Ruth stood beside Eleanor and held the flowers because someone needed to, and Ruth was always the person who figured out what needed doing and did it. She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier. But she held Eleanor's hand before the ceremony started and held it in the way that said everything a 12-year-old girl knows about loss and hope and the complicated business of letting things change. "You okay?" Eleanor asked her. "Are you?" Ruth said. Eleanor looked at Thorne, who was standing across from her in his best shirt, which was not a fancy shirt but was clean and had been ironed by someone who had never ironed a shirt before and had applied considerable effort, and who was looking back at her with that expression she had spent 4 months learning to read. That expression which was, she now understood, simply honesty. Some people had learned to wear their faces as armor, to keep the real things behind controlled surfaces. Thorne had never learned that, or had unlearned it in 7 years alone on a mountain, and everything he felt showed in him plainly, without performance. What he felt right now, looking at her, was perfectly clear. Yes, Eleanor told Ruth. I'm okay. Thomas walked her across the clearing, which had not been planned and which he simply did, appearing at her elbow with the formal seriousness of a 15-year-old taking on a role he'd decided was his to take. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she thought about Harold saying, "Call it even," and thought, nothing is ever even. But maybe that's all right. Maybe the imbalance is what keeps things moving forward. She took Thomas's arm and walked across the September clearing to stand in front of Thorne Calloway, and the mountain was very quiet around them, and the sky was the particular blue that only Colorado gets in September, hard and clean and without compromise. There were no speeches that day. Vera had suggested someone might want to say something meaningful, and Eleanor had said that the meaningful things had already been said, mostly in cabins and courtrooms and on mountain trails in the dark, and that the ceremony was just the part where you made it official, and Vera had said fair enough. It was fair enough. Clara's ribbon fell off midway through, and she spent the rest of the ceremony trying to get it back on her head, which meant that the one surviving record of the day, a photograph taken by Parks, who had brought a camera up the mountain with the cheerful determination of a man who understood historical significance, showed 8 faces in various states of solemnity and one 4-year-old in fierce negotiation with a blue ribbon. Eleanor kept that photograph on the mantel for the rest of her life. The years that followed were not easy. No years are easy. Not really, not if you're paying attention. There were hard winters and sick children and a collapse in silver prices one season that required real recalculation, and there was Thomas at 16 deciding he wanted to go to Denver to study law, which Eleanor had complicated feelings about and supported completely, and there was Clara at 6 falling out of the hayloft and breaking her wrist, and the 3 hours before they knew the extent of it being some of the worst 3 hours of Eleanor's memory. There were mornings when Thorne's particular kind of silence was the wrong kind and she had to say so, and mornings when her own grief surfaced in ways that were unfair to him, and she had to say that too. The saying so was, she came to understand, the whole thing. The mechanism by which people who were trying to build something together actually built it rather than just inhabiting the same space. Harold had not said so. He had held things inside to protect her, and the things had grown in the dark, too large and too late. She and Thorne said so. Imperfectly, not always in the right words, sometimes too late or too bluntly or not bluntly enough. But they said so. Ruth became a teacher. James became a carpenter, which would have made Harold smile in that private way he had. Ben and May, the twins, both stayed on the mountain into adulthood because they had been young enough when they arrived that the mountain was simply home, as ordinary and as essential as breathing. Thomas practiced law in Denver and came back every summer and argued with Thorne about everything from mining regulations to the best wood for exterior joints, and Thorne let him win about half the time, which was itself a kind of education. Clara grew up to be exactly who she had always been, the person who looked at every situation from a sideways angle and found the thing nobody else had thought to mention. She married a man from Pueblo at 20 who had the specific quality of finding her sideways angle delightful rather than bewildering, which Eleanor considered the most reliable indicator of character she had encountered. Thorne's shoulder, which had been hit by a ricocheted splinter in the attack on the cabin. Eleanor had not mentioned this in the chaos of that night, and had only discovered it the following morning when she noticed him moving his left arm carefully, healed badly, and ached in cold weather for the rest of his life. He never complained about it. Eleanor kept track of the cold days and made sure there was heat in the cabin before he woke up on those mornings, and he knew she was doing it, and he never mentioned that he knew, and this was the private economy of a long marriage. The mountain became known over the years in the territory as Iron Ridge, which was not what Thorne had called it, and was not a name anyone had formally assigned, but which arrived the way names arrive, out of accumulated use, out of the particular accumulation of a story that people kept telling. The story of the mountain couple. The woman who had faced down a banking conspiracy and a town's indifference and a gang of hired guns with an iron poker. The man who had come down from 7 years of solitude and walked into a town square because of a debt someone else said was settled. People told it differently in different places. Some versions were more accurate than others. Eleanor heard a version once, in a general store in the territory capital, that had her as 6 feet tall, and the final confrontation as a battle involving considerably more violence than had actually occurred, and she had stood there listening with her basket in her hand and had decided against correcting it. Let them have the bigger version, she thought. The real one was big enough. What the real one was, stripped of all embellishment in its plain original form, was this. A woman had been pushed past the point where a reasonable person continues, and had continued anyway. A man had kept a promise that the person he made it to would never know he kept. A boy had held a rifle in the dark on a mountain and chosen not to pull the trigger until he had to, which was the right choice and the harder one. Children had been quiet in a back room when quiet was what was needed. A 12-year-old had held flowers and not cried. A 4-year-old had asked if there would be biscuits, which in retrospect was the most honest response to crisis anyone had managed. And a family had been made, not from perfect materials and not under easy conditions, but from the specific combination of people who showed up when it mattered and stayed when staying was hard, and said the necessary things even when the saying was uncomfortable. Eleanor Brooks, Eleanor Calloway, after September of 1879, lived on Iron Ridge for 31 more years. She outlived the silver market's volatility and the territory becoming a state and 3 different sheriffs in Caldwell Creek, and eventually Caldwell Creek itself, which shrank and dwindled and finally faded into a collection of 3 buildings and a water trough, which seemed to her a fair outcome for a town that had watched 7 children being sold for debt and said nothing. She outlived Thorne by 4 years. He went in the winter the way he would have wanted, quietly, without commotion, on a morning when the mountain was cold and still. She sat with him and held his hand, which was scarred across the knuckles in the way it had always been. And she thought about a man on a large horse in a town square, making a declaration that shocked everyone present, including, she was fairly sure, himself. She thought about all the things he had never been. Not smooth, not easy, not the kind of man who said the right thing at the right moment with any consistency. Difficult sometimes, and silent when silence was wrong, and certain about his own judgment in ways that were occasionally infuriating. Human all the way through, without the pretense of being otherwise. She thought about what he had been, which was this: a man who showed up. Completely, without reservation, on a day when no one else did. Who locked the door against bears and explained it when asked. Who stood outside in October cold because he'd said he would. Who looked at a tired woman in a dry goods store and saw something worth remembering, and remembered it, and came back when it mattered. She held his hand until the mountain was warm again. Then she got up and put more wood on the fire, because the cabin was cold and there was still warmth to make. And Eleanor Brooks had never in her life waited for someone else to do what needed doing. She wasn't going to start now.